Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, there are so many interpretations of the Dharma in the world. Have there been attempts to synthesize them into a singular, coherent way of thinking? Is that even possible?
I think that it is possible, but incredibly difficult. The Dharma itself can be difficult to make sense of as a singular way of thinking and practicing. Then, when you add on the disciples' many interpretations of it, things become much harder.
It seems like a monumental task. How would one even start such a thing?
Many have tried to selectively ignore contradictory aspects of the Dharma. They often have some kind of reasoning in doing so, but nevertheless.
I see. Interesting.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing Gelug Buddhism. What is Gelug Buddhism? What are some of its similarities and differences to other schools of Buddhism? What is its historical significance? We hope you enjoy.
So let's get started. What is Gelug Buddhism?
Gelug Buddhism is one of the four major schools of Tibetan Buddhism. It's most well known for being the sect of Buddhism led by the Dalai Lama. Though it's the youngest of the four sects, it is one of the most popular and well-known schools of Buddhism in the whole world due to the public-facing nature of the Dalai Lama, especially in light of the last 100 years of Tibetan history. The visibility of Gelug Buddhism is such that many in the West actually mistakenly think that the Dalai Lama is like a pope of Buddhism, and thus leads and represents all schools of Buddhism across the world. This is actually not the case, and we'll give some more detail about that later on. To start with, let's look at the history of Gelug Buddhism. Gelug Buddhism was founded by Tsongkhapa in the 15th century. We discussed Tsongkhapa in episode 128, What is Tibetan Buddhism?, linked in the show notes. Here, we will give some more detail. Tsongkhapa was a Central Asian monk and yogi who lived from 1357 to 1419. His name, Tsongkhapa, means man from Tsongkha, and Ja means lord or sir. Tsongkha is a city in what is now the metro area of Xining, China, in the Qinghai province, in the west. When Tsongkhapa was born, the region was part of the Kingdom of Tibet, and the city of Tsongkha was just a small, walled hill town. Tsongkhapa's father was Mongolian and his mother was Tibetan. Take note of this Tibetan and Mongolian connection. Gelug Buddhism will become the dominant form of Buddhism not only in Tibet, but in Mongolia as well. It remains so to this day, and Tsongkhapa's family connection plays a huge part in that process. Tsongkhapa's family was nomadic, so they traveled through much of Central Asia. Tsongkhapa, however, was educated from a very early age by a Kadam school monk named Choje Dondru Rinchen. Tsongkhapa would become a lifelong admirer of Kadam Buddhism, and we will see that Gelug Buddhism actually possesses many close similarities to it. Kadam is now defunct, and much of what we know about it comes from Gelug Buddhism and the work of Tsongkhapa under the tutelage of Choje Dondru Rinchen. Once he grew old enough, he traveled south to the Utsang region of Tibet, and there he first entered the tutelage of Choje Dondru Rinchen, and he learned a lot of different practices from both the Kadam schools of Buddhism and the Shakya schools, which Choje Dondru Rinchen occupied kind of both lineages. There he studied and trained in concepts such as the Mahamudra. Mahamudra is what is called a multivalent term in Central Asian religions, a word which has multiple meanings, contexts, and usages. Another example of a multivalent term that we use all the time is Dharma. In the context of Tsongkhapa and his upbringing, Mahamudra refers to a body of teachings that were popular in the Shakya school of Buddhism and the Kadam school both during his life. Maha, as we know, means great, and mudra means seal or imprint. And here we're using seal or imprint in the same way that we would say the three Dharma seals. The Mahamudra is a particular strain of esoteric Buddhist teachings that focus on Tantra and yoga. For reference, Tantra refers to a body or category of practice prescribed by specific texts in Indian traditions, and yoga refers to all practice in general. It was heavily emphasized in the Shakya school of Buddhism, but it was popular among all schools of Tibetan Buddhism at the time. As we'll see, the sectarian categorizations are historically read backwards onto history. In practice, they did not preclude any monastic from training in multiple lineages and traditions. Choje Dondrub Rinchen is a perfect example of this, being part of both the Shakya and Kadam lineages, and of course, Tsongkhapa can claim ancestry and lineage in both as well. One of the central doctrines of Mahamudra is that one is initiated into a tradition, then engages in tantric practices related to manifesting particular Buddhist deities in themselves and in the world. Each new tantric practice is transmitted through initiation after the previous one is completed. Once the stages of deity yoga, as these are called, are completed, the practitioner is opened up to the realm of Mahamudra. Within this scope are the practice of mantra, mudra, and mandala, the practice of possession and powa, and meditation on the co-emergence of emptiness, wisdom, and fully self-realized suchness. These are the compass points for Shakya and Gelug Buddhist practice, being able to see, realize, and experience these ideas in the world around us. In addition to Mahamudra, Tsongkhapa was educated in the 6 dharmas of Naropa. These are 6 teachings that were compiled by the Indian Buddhist master Naropa in the 11th century and passed down in Indian and Tibetan Buddhism ever since. These are 6 domains in which the monk trains themselves. They are Tummo, the yoga of inner heat or mystic heat; Usel, the yoga of clear light, radiance, or luminosity; Milam, the yoga of the dream state; Gyulu, the yoga of the illusory body, or the mind-made body; Bardo, the yoga of the intermediate state; and Powa, the yoga of transference of consciousness into a pure Buddha field. As you can see, there's some overlap between these two and the tantric practices involved in deity manifestation, or in Mahamudra. That may make it seem more complicated, but it actually makes it less so. All of these practices revolve around building a strong, multifaceted foundation of a facility with these abstract concepts and experiences, and they represent multiple routes of achieving that facility. Both these 6 dharmas and the Mahamudra are presented as a shortened path straight to fully realized Buddhahood without having to go through any other stages first. They're meant to be trained all together, and the end result is successful entrance into total Buddhahood. All that Tsongkhapa trained in, including Abhidharma textual studies, Tantra practices, and prevalent yoga traditions, were very prevalent among all the extant schools of Tibetan Buddhism at the time, and were not exclusive to any one school. In that regard, Gelug Buddhism would emerge as a very cosmopolitan and synthetic school of Buddhism, meaning that it synthesized a lot of concepts and practices from many different sources. After training with several masters and composing original treatises himself, Tsongkhapa and one of his companions began to have visions of Manjushri. In these visions, Manjushri orally transmitted several teachings to Tsongkhapa and his companion. Soon after, Tsongkhapa also reported having a momentous enlightenment experience where he gained great insight into the nature of emptiness and dependent origination. In the experience, he reported having dreams of historical Buddhist masters, including Nagarjuna, Buddhapalita, Aryadeva, and Chandrakirti. Nagarjuna's name will be familiar, but the rest are just Abhidharma masters and commentarians on the sutras, who we have not read or discussed thus far. In the dreams that Tsongkhapa was having, Buddhapalita placed a text wrapped in cloth on top of his head. This caused him to wake up and start reading Buddhapalita's commentary on Nagarjuna's middle way verses, where a great deal of emptiness philosophy in Buddhism originates. This contributed significantly to Tsongkhapa's enlightenment experience regarding emptiness. Tsongkhapa continued to write on his conception of the Buddhist path, which synthesized all of these different sources that he learned from, and these texts would become the foundations for the Gelug school of Buddhism. He died at age 62 in 1419. By that time, he had amassed a huge following, and his disciples even had followers of their own as well. Among them were preeminent monks and thinkers in all of the Tibetan Buddhist traditions, but importantly, one of his disciples would go on to be the first Dalai Lama, Gendon Drup, who actually created the position.
What are some of Gelug Buddhism's similarities and differences to other schools of Buddhism?
Speaking to what Gelug Buddhism teaches, we can say that it's very synthetic as a school of Buddhism and shares a great deal with the Nyingma, Jonang, Shakya, and Kagyu schools. It's also synthetic of what we may think of as non-Buddhist traditions, such as Hinduism, Tibetan Bon, and Jainism. Then, at its core, is a very strong thread from earlier Madhyamika or Middle Way Buddhism and the work of Nagarjuna. This may make it sound like Gelug Buddhism is a big melting pot that just has everything in it. And to a certain extent, it kind of is, but it's synthetic of these traditions in a way that creates a new, original, and internally coherent system of study and practice. And so let's get into how it all works. Very importantly, Tsongkhapa interprets emptiness as directly implying dependent origination, and vice versa. Remember that emptiness is the assertion that nothing has any inherent or substantial existence, and dependent origination is the assertion that things in reality arise and cease due to causes and conditions. What is new with Tsongkhapa is the argument that emptiness and dependent origination are two sides of the same coin. Building on that, he argues that the way that emptiness and dependent origination are connected must also imply that conventional reality arises with a specific consciousness of that thing that simultaneously arises as well. In other words, that which arises in the world inherently arises with the capacity to be cognized. This is because that which arises is empty, and the mind arises and is also empty. So, that shared nature creates an inherent causal relationship between anything in reality and the mind. In other words, that which we observe and our minds themselves are both empty, and thus share a same nature that allows them to interface with each other. This co-arising of things, their ability to be cognized, and cognition itself constitutes conventional everyday reality. This tripartite co-arising is what he argues constitutes the stream of consciousness that we experience in our lives. Delusion, he argues, is caused by this inherent relationship between the mind and the cognizability of reality as it presents itself to us. If we were to ask him why he thinks that's the case, he would answer with our familiar friend, mind-only doctrine, which is popularized in Yogacara Buddhism. Tsongkhapa's thought borrows a great deal from Madhyamika Buddhism, but also, of course, all of these other schools as well. Where it differs from other schools of Buddhism, like the Jonang school for example, is that it interprets even the Dharma and emptiness itself as being empty, only existing as causally dependent signifiers or representations of themselves, rather than actual things in reality that exist. He argues that because of the delusion in our everyday stream of consciousness, the names, concepts, and ideas we have for things are only somewhat related to the things themselves. The word and the idea impermanence does not capture the nature of impermanence as it actually is. They're only imperfect signifiers that emerge from a deluded mind to represent something much more complicated that can't be captured in words, and can only be fully grasped once one reaches enlightenment. We shouldn't be mistaking the name for a thing or the idea of the thing we have in our minds for the thing itself. By comparison, Jonang and some Kagyu Buddhists argued that capital D Dharma is not empty at all, and that it actually exists. The words and the ideas they refer to were regarded as not being subject to emptiness or even to impermanence themselves. Tsongkhapa, however, introduced the idea that reference and referent are different from a cognitive and linguistic and religious point of view, and that this difference can lead to further delusion if it's not checked. Looking further into the teachings of Gelug Buddhism, it also strongly emphasizes the lamrim, or the steps on the path. This is a relatively rigid, stepwise sequence of practice, study, and initiation that was laid out by Tsongkhapa in his writings. This path serves as a diagnosis for the particular level of a practitioner's realization, as well as stages that they need to practice to reach higher levels of realization. The lowest level is those with wrong views and afflictions, preventing their enlightenment, and it works its way up through 3 sets of stages for getting out of that state of affliction. These sets of stages are seeking better rebirths in samsara, seeking nirvana, and seeking Buddhahood. Thus, they contrast with the Mahayana concept of the Arhat, the Pratyeka Buddha, the Bodhisattva, and the Buddha stages of the path. Here instead, we have a set of stages that look like lay practice, then a set for arhatship, and then a set for fully realized Buddhahood. There is no distinct set of stages for Pratyeka Buddhahood or Bodhisattvahood. The stages of practice include things like meditating on compassion, being initiated into the practice of mantra and mandala, and then even more abstract stuff, like fulfilling vows that look a lot like Bodhisattva vows, and establishing your own fully realized Buddhahood. Gelug Buddhism is also highly tantric and esoteric in practice. And so, once you get to the higher stages of the Lamrim, you're beginning to engage in deity yoga, which calls upon the practitioner to manifest the given deity by means of imitation. This imitation is taught and transmitted secretly, as the true meaning or the spirit of the imitation is thought to be an esoteric truth. Simultaneously, Gelug Buddhism also mandates the Mahayana practice of the 6 bodhisattva perfections, or the 6 paramitas. We've learned these before as generosity, moral conduct, patience, diligence, meditation, and wisdom. Again, these are not separated out as a specific bodhisattva stage or a bodhisattva practice set. Instead, they are Buddhahood practices. This is shared across Indian and East Asian Mahayana and all of Central Asian Vajrayana. Another point where Gelug Buddhism differs strongly from Chinese Mahayana Buddhism is that there is still a very strict emphasis on the Vinaya rules for monks and nuns. These become increasingly questioned, challenged, and ignored as Mahayana Buddhism spreads across East Asia, but Gelug Buddhism still enforced those rules for its monastics up until very recently in history, and many Gelug Buddhists still do observe these rules even to this day. Part of the reason why that the Vinaya rules are still enforced is the synthetic nature of practice and doctrine in Gelug. All paths are validated and incorporated as part of a person's practice. If a particular method or practice is thought to be slower or less effective, it's not dropped, as in the case of many Mahayana sects of Buddhism. Instead, it's preserved in the spirit of creating a well-rounded practice, building a strong and wide foundation for Buddhahood to be realized, and allowing any possible path to potentially lead to success in that practice.
What is Gelug Buddhism's historical significance?
Since the 16th century, Gelug Buddhism has been the dominant school of Tibetan Buddhism, both in Tibet but also in Mongolia. It has had the most adherents in monasteries, but it has also been politically dominant. We've talked previously about how Tibetan Buddhism is a political institution as well as a religious one. Historically speaking, the role of the Dalai Lama has been positioned as the political leader of the ethno-state of Tibet, and the Dalai Lama and everything he oversees is Gelug. Nyingma, Jonang, Kadam, and Kagyu do not have and did not have sovereignty over Tibet, nor do they have this leader that we call the Dalai Lama. The story of how this position emerged as such a powerful leader is quite fascinating. In the 16th century, the third Dalai Lama carried out a great deal of missionary activity in Mongolia, and he also forged a strong alliance with the most powerful Khan at the time, Altan Khan, based on the generations of relationship between Tsongkhapa and his primary disciples. This gave the Gelug school a great deal of popularity and patronage from the Mongol Khans, who supported the Dalai Lama rising to political preeminence in Tibet. The other schools of Buddhism simply could not compete with the resources that Gelug Buddhism had thanks to the Mongol Khans. There was even some military conflict among them that mirrored our typical view of warlords fighting over land and over rulership of a region. But what was at stake was religio-political rulership of Gelug Buddhism and of the Tibetan people. Gelug, with the assistance of the Mongols, came out on top from that conflict, and this cemented the Dalai Lama as the leader of not just the religion, but the people as well. Speaking further to the historical significance of Gelug Buddhism, we've discussed that in 1959, Tibet was invaded by the Chinese, and the 14th and current Dalai Lama were forced to flee Tibet to go to India. The Dalai Lama is now a leader in exile, and he maintains an exile government composed of high-ranking Gelug monks. While the persecution of Tibet and of Tibetan Buddhism has done a lot of damage to people's lives in Tibet, especially the ones who could not flee, the annexation did have a silver lining. It pushed Gelug Buddhism and the issue of Tibetan sovereignty into the international limelight. China's military actions in Tibet have been denounced by almost the entire international community. It was a brazen and forcible theft of sovereign land for no other real reason than the ongoing racial tensions between Tibetans and Chinese people, and because of China's military supremacy and economic greed. It caused needless loss of life, and there is no telling if it will ever be rectified with Tibetan sovereignty restored. However, more people know about and sympathize with the Tibetan people's plight and with Gelug Buddhism than ever would have before. The 1960s onward saw a huge spike in interest in all forms of Buddhism, but Tibetan Buddhism in particular, in the West, and the Dalai Lama was positioned well to lead the conversation between the West and Asia about what Buddhism is all about. Because of this, like I've said before, when Westerners typically think of Buddhism and all of its practices and figures, the images that come to mind are almost exclusively Gelug in nature. They think of the Dalai Lama, a Gelug religious role. They think of mandalas, a Gelug practice. They think of Gelug red and yellow robes, and more. Also, for better or worse, many of the misinterpretations and misimaginations about Buddhism that Westerners have are partially as a result of the Dalai Lama trying to create a public image of Buddhism as a religion that is suited to modernity, suited to people more interested in spirituality and philosophy than an organized religion, and suited to rationalistic and empirical thinking. The Dalai Lama has been one of the most vocal proponents of Buddhist modernism, which we've discussed on the show as having many problems. However, the Dalai Lama's reasoning in presenting Buddhism in this way serves a practical purpose: to drive international interest and engagement and sympathy for the Tibetan cause. I don't bring up the issue of Buddhist modernism to criticize the Dalai Lama. I bring it up to clarify that China's annexation of Tibet turned international attention to him. When the world listens to him discuss Buddhism, he's chosen what he said very carefully, with the goal of garnering support not just for the Tibetan cause in an ideological and geopolitical sense, but also for his version of Gelug Buddhism in a religious sense. Given what I've discussed here, I believe that Tibetan Buddhism is the most historically significant form of Buddhism in the last 100 years, especially in the West. The circumstances of the Dalai Lama's modernizing ideology and the Chinese annexation of Tibet have made it the most visible and vocal form of Buddhism. It has led the world to think of the Dalai Lama as the Pope of Buddhism, and it has led to international support for Gelug Buddhism's cause and for Tibetan sovereignty. Of course, the work of other East Asian Buddhist modernizers has been significant as well. For example, D.T. Suzuki has also had his time in the spotlight. But I don't think that anyone has left as much of a striking impression on the world as the 14th Dalai Lama has.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of Gelug Buddhism. Join us next week where we will be discussing the Medicine Buddha, Baisa Jaguru. Who is Baisa Jaguru? What are some stories about him? What is his significance? Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Hi, Nick here, and you've been listening to Bright on Buddhism. Normally at this point in the episode, we would throw to a charity that we think that is deserving of your money or your support. Because there's so much going on right now, we have decided that we're going to open it up to any charity that you think is a good cause to share your resources with. So, if you like our show and would like to support us, please instead give to a charity that you believe does good things for people in need. Thank you.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.